Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Wednesday, May 29th, and we've got part 2 of our 4-part draft strategy series with our guy, Steve, a.k.a. the Foresight Encyclopedia. And I'm pumped to continue to share so much great historical ADP info with everyone, and we've got the super interesting running backs for you this week. How you doing tonight, Jay?
You know what, Ben? After last week's episode and what we uncovered and the data that we went through, I am so excited to get going tonight and take a look at these running backs, man. I'm excited. And you know what? I'm looking forward to some good news. So let's take a look, man. I cannot wait to get going. Steve-O, how you doing?
Guys, I'm pretty pumped to be back this week. I appreciate being on last week. I had a blast talking about the quarterbacks, and I think we're going to have a great time tonight talking about these running backs. And Jay, I know, my friend, you just asked me how I'm doing. I'm doing fantastic. I'm talking like Christian McCaffrey in PPR redraft leagues from last season kind of fantastic is how I'm doing. Oh, yeah. I got the kids are in bed. I'm talking fantasy football with you guys. And quite frankly, I kind of can't wait to see how Jay's going to react tonight through all this ROI research on these running backs.
Hey, as long as you bring me some good news, we are good to go, my friend.
We'll see about that.
Yes, we will. And just to remind everybody, this is a 5-year historical study as far as the return on investment for the running backs that were ranked 1 through 12 in ADP over each of the last 5 seasons. We're going to take a look at where they were drafted, how they performed, and go through whether or not they were strong ROI and okay ROI, or if they were straight up bust. And Steve is going to go into that in a little more detail here in a second.
And don't forget that you can find a lot of this information on our blog tab at fantasyforesight.com under the Foresight Encyclopedia tab. Steve, remind everybody where you got all the data. Where is it coming from, my friend?
All right, well, guys, everything is 12-team PPR redraft. And where I get my ADP information from is fantasyfootballcalculator.com. They're a great resource for historical ADP information. And then where I get my fantasy finishes from is actually our affiliate partner, fantasypros.com, just a tried and true website that I've been using for years and years now. And I do want to say and point out that when I do these studies, I really focus strictly on weeks 1 through 16 when it comes to how I determine who finished where in a fantasy season. And as I've mentioned before, that's just because a vast majority of the fantasy football leagues that I've ever heard of, known of, I think the industry as a whole considers week 16 the championship week. So I just like to focus on, absolutely. I like to focus on weeks 1 through 16 because that to me is what correlates with our actual fantasy football seasons.
You're absolutely right, Steve, and that goes right along with our perception versus reality theme that this entire draft strategy series is geared around. I mean, the ADP is the noise, the perception, the preseason rankings, and all the hype and all the rose-colored glasses. Everybody's going to play 16 games. We don't rank based on whether or not they're injured, because if they're, quote, injured that week, then you can take them out of your lineup, and that's A-okay with us. Then not so much here at Fantasy Foresight. We're trying to win championships over here. The reality is you need to look at weeks 1 through 16. The reality is you need to look at total foresight.
Well said, my friend.
Well, let's get right into it and check out these exciting running backs, arguably the most versatile, explosive, and volatile position in fantasy football. Okay, so here's how it's going to work tonight. We'll start with the ADP RB1 and work our way through the 5-year history, and then Jay's going to bring it around to current value concept as of today, May 29th, according to 12-team PPR leagues at fantasyfootballcalculator.com, to give you just a name to understand this is the guy we're talking about, attaching to these numbers and these concepts, and really pay attention to the reality versus the perception, and maybe change the way that you're looking at your draft strategy a little bit. Once we're done with the top 12 running backs, we'll have some very interesting bonus study results to share as well, and we'll get to that at the end. But for now, Steve, let's get right into it and see how Jay is going to react to this information.
Don't you start with me, you two. I said I was calm. All right, Steve, give me some news about the ADP RB1. 100% outstanding return on investments across the board. Am I right? Am I right?
You guys have both been playing fantasy long enough to know that, man, nailing these running backs in the early parts of your draft, especially in redraft year after year, it can be an extremely difficult thing to do. And that's certainly going to show through here, I think, tonight as we dive into this study. Now, before I do get started and go through those RB1s, ADP over the past 5 years, I do want to explain to our audience briefly what constitutes a strong return on investment versus a okay, middling kind of return on investment versus just an outright bust. So what I considered a strong return on investment is if you finish 5 positional spots from where you were drafted. So if I take somebody as the RB1 in my draft and you finish, say, RB6, for example, that's on the outer part of it, but you would still be considered to have returned a strong return on investment. You're going to be happy with that pick. Now, okay return on investment, that's going to be somebody that finishes within 6 to 11 spots positionally from where they were drafted. And then as far as a bust is concerned, that's going to be somebody who's way outside, 12 spots or further down the ladder from where you drafted them. The kind of guys are really going to, hurt your season if you took them. Say, for example, you take somebody like Christian McCaffrey as an RB2 in your draft, and he finishes as RB18, just a middling RB2 when you were expecting an upper echelon running back. That to me is a bust. So with that being said, let's dive into it and take a look at how the RB1s.
Real quick before we get into it, Steve, I just want to let everybody know why it's a little different with what we're considering a strong ROI and a bust and everything in between this week versus quarterbacks, because as everybody knows, typically, unless you're in a super flex league, you're only going to have 12 starting quarterbacks, say, in a 12-team league versus running backs. You're usually going to have 48 running backs drafted. So there's a lot more running backs. You're starting multiple running backs every week, depending on your league. It could be anywhere from 2 to 5 or anything in between. So, just to give everybody a little bit of perspective of why, a -5 return on your investment for running backs is still considered a strong ROI.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ben. That's a very good point, because you're absolutely right. We could be starting anywhere from 2 to 5 running backs. So if you can nail a guy within 5 spots, you're still going to feel pretty dang good about it.
Yes, sir.
So last year we had Todd Gurley. He was going as the consensus 101 and finished as the RB2 overall. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a fantastic return on investment. I'm happy with that pick all day long. Now in 2017, the year prior to that, David Johnson also going as the consensus 101 in drafts, finishes as RB 109. He had that unfortunate dislocation of his wrist where he essentially missed the entire season. And believe me, I was one of those guys that owned David Johnson that year, and it hurt. It hurt. Now, in 2016, David Johnson also is our consensus RB1 going at the 103, and he came through as perfectly as you possibly can at that position, finishing as the RB1 in fantasy. You can't play it any better than that. Now,
wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in 2015, you had Adrian Peterson, your RB1 in all of redraft, go with the 102, finishes as RB2. Again, excellent return on investment. And then in 2014, you had LaShawn Shady McCoy going at the 102 as your RB1 in redraft. Finishes as RB12. So not a bust, but there were some red flags going into that season. It was his first year in Buffalo.
What do you mean by that?
I mean exactly what I said.
I love it. So, wow, man, over the course of 5 years at the ADP RB1 position, I got to be honest, I was expecting a lot more volatility. You're telling me that 60% of the time we're getting a strong return on your investment, which is an elite running back, probably one of the top scorers in all of fantasy football. And then 20% of the time you're not even busting. You're just getting an okay return on your investment. So you can't necessarily win your fantasy football season in the first round, but you can definitely lose your fantasy football season in the first round. And then 20% of the time you're busting. So, surprisingly consistent 5-year returns.
Especially compared to the quarterbacks that we covered in the last episode. I mean, this is an amazing difference between the running backs and the quarterbacks.
Right.
So, who is the consensus RB1 in drafts going so far this year? As of today, at the 102, the second overall pick in drafts, is my guy, Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, for tried and true listeners of this podcast, you know Saquon's long-standing history with Jay on this podcast.
I love him, man. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, you love him now. You love him now.
I knew he was going to be a dominant player in this league. I've called it since day one. I mean,
don't feel bad, brother.
Guy?
I called for Keelan Cole to have a monster season last year too. So, anyways.
So, I don't think anybody can really argue with Saquon at this point going number one overall. I mean, you've got a handful of guys going near the top, but you see what the expected return is, 60 to 80% of meeting the investment at the number one spot. And I'm not sure anybody's going to doubt that Saquon is going to provide that for you this season.
I was just going to say that the numbers kind of align with what I would imagine without discussing it as to our consensus agreement on Saquon. I don't know about you two, but I have every confidence in the world that Saquon's going to be a monster beast workhorse. He's going to get fed a ton of targets, ton of carries. He's going to return for you just fine, just like we've seen the majority of these consensus RB1s over the last 5 years.
Yep. All right. Now, Steve, the RB2 in ADP over the last 5 years, is it as consistently successful as the RB1s, or are we going to see a difference there?
Jay, I mean, it's a little bit of a dip, but when you think about these RB1s going number one overall at their position in drafts, outside of suffering some kind of catastrophic injury like you saw with David Johnson, I mean, they're pretty much locked and loaded for solid RB1, if not upper echelon kind of performance. All right, and when you look at the ADP RB2s, guys, it's not as successful as the RB1s, but I mean, we still see a lot of positivity there. So last year, we had David Johnson going at the 103 as the RB2 in drafts, finishes as the RB9. So, okay return on investment. In 2017, you got Le'Veon Bell going at the 102 in drafts, right behind David Johnson, finishes right where you drafted him as the RB2 in fantasy football. So, I mean, no complaints there if you're taking Le'Veon Bell at that spot. Exactly.
Nice.
Now, in 2016, we can all blame Jeff Fisher for this one. Todd Gurley going at the 106 is the RB2 in fantasy football, finishes as RB18. And that, my friends, I do consider a bust.
Yeah. That's what Jeff Fisher will do to you.
Exactly. And then in 2015, we have Le'Veon Bell once again. He's been going high in drafts for years, right? Going as the RB2 at the 103, finishes as RB44. And that is the year where he, I believe, tore his ACL in the earlier portion of the season. So just bear that in mind. And then in 2014, we had Jamal Charles going as the RB2 at the 103 in drafts. Finishes at the RB7, so right on the fringe of what constitutes still returning a strong return on investment.
Yeah, and I'd like to note that the 5-year average finish for the ADP RB2 is RB16 overall, which is not what you strive for, but it's good to know that over the course of the last 5 years, you're probably not going to bust if you go the way of ADP RB2, but it's nothing close to the impressive results that we saw for the ADP RB1s. 40% of the time, you're getting a strong ROI on ADP RB2s, but just as often, 40% of the time they're busting, and then 20% of the time is So the positional volatility seems to be starting to kind of rear its ugly head, where the majority is either really high upside or really high downside, which we constitute as a bust.
Listen, I don't want to jinx the guy who currently holds the RB2 position, and we talked about somebody who really caused that average finish for RB2s over the last 5 years to be a lot higher than what it should have been due to injury, and I don't want to put that on the guy who I'm about to say, because I got a lot of love for him, but currently going at the 103 spot, RB2 overall in drafts, our guy, Alvin Kamara. I don't want to put that bad juju on him. I mean, come on, man. He's going to be fine. He's going to be that 40% that returns a positive return on investment, right?
Don't you put that evil on my guy, Ricky Bobby.
That's right. That's right.
So, yeah, I mean, hopefully he's the exception. And like I alluded to before, we've got some bonus content to cover at the end of these top 12 RBs, where Kamara is going to be, really one of the focal points of that discussion.
Well, and as we've been leading up to this, we have been monitoring these ADPs, and Kamara has moved up. Zeke, surprisingly, moving out of that RB2 spot so far, and Kamara taken over, and you've got guys like CMC. I mean, you've got a lot of talent there. there, a lot of elite talent at the top end. Very interesting to see how that positioning is changing as we move through the preseason. Steve, you got anything to add?
Well, Ben already alluded to it a little bit, but yeah, what we're going to talk about at the end of the podcast, let's just say it's extremely rare and extremely difficult for these running backs to string together 3 consecutive top 5 fantasy finishes. It just simply does not really happen.
Oh, come on, man. I just said don't put that bad juju on my guy. He's had 2 good seasons. No.
There can always be exceptions to the rules, but like we always talk about, we are looking at strictly by the numbers and the overall probabilities and aggregates. He can be your exception, Jay. You can choose to go that route if you want to. It's subjective, and we all get to make our bets on who we want to make our bets on. And the beauty of fantasy football, we get to see who's right.
I know I'm supposed to take emotion out of this, but I don't want to. I'm moving on. All right, Steve. ADP RB3 overall. How does it look compared to what we've covered so far?
I mean, you know what, Jay? It's solid. So last year, I mean, Le'Veon Bell was going at the 103, and we all know how that worked out.
He's broken hearts a couple of times.
Oh, yeah. No, he certainly has. He's won you some championships. He's also certainly just destroyed your season as well. So, and, you know, that's just a lot of Pittsburgh Steeler players. I don't like them. But
lots of love on this podcast for the Steeler Nation.
So I don't want to spend too much time on him, but the prior season, in kind of a similar situation as far as somebody who is getting drafted going into the season, because you had Ezekiel Elliott with the suspension stuff kind of up in the air, and you had Zeke going as the RB3 going at the 106 and finishes RB14, which is very impressive considering he didn't play the first 6 games.
Yeah.
But you are going to be pretty disappointed overall, I think, drafting him there. Not necessarily a bust. Gave you some good productivity, but, you know.
Overall, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in 2016, you also have Ezekiel Elliott. And this guy won some people leagues. The people that were willing to reach out and take Zeke as the RB3 at the 108 overall, got an RB2 finish out of Zeke. And I mean, that's why people are, you know, everyone wants to draft Zeke year in and year out, you know, even facing the suspension in 2017. Now in 2015, you had, Eddie Lacy.
Oh, boy.
And I hate to admit it, I had shares this season, guys.
So, oh my God, I love these blasts from the past, 2015 and 14.
My favorite
it's so
part
fun.
of doing this research is just the so many fond memories, some not so fond, and I guess this is one of those. So Eddie Lacy was going as the RB3 in drafts at the 104, guys. Finished as RB31. Destroyed a lot of seasons for people, mine included. Now in 2014, Matt Forte going at the 104 was your locked and loaded RB3 in drafts, and he finished as RB2. So an incredible return on investment as far as that pick's concerned.
Yeah, didn't he win Ruxin a league championship that year or something like that?
That's probably right.
Pretty sure he did.
So when you look at the percentages for the ADP RB3s over the last 5 years, it's identical to the ADP RB2s, where 80% of the time it's going to be boom or bust, 40% boom, 40% bust, and 20% of the time it's going to be in the middle. So overall, that equates to 60% of the time it's not worth it. So starting off, ADP RB1 looking pretty good. Since then, RB2 and RB3 not so much.
Yeah, no kidding. And, you know, it's interesting the guy currently going as RB3 in drafts because we talked about his name numerous times in this RB3 spot so far, and that's Ezekiel Elliott going 103 overall. On average, he has returned an RB2 value. He's returned an RB14 value in this spot already so far in his career. Now, like Steve mentioned, that RB14 was in a shortened season due to suspension. But, I mean, that's pretty decent value for Zeke. But that risk for why he missed games previously is rearing its ugly head, and that risk is now baking into his sliding ADP.
Yeah, it could be. You got Steve, Mr. Owner in our league, a record of one King Ezekiel. He's shaking his head over there, but, you know,
he'll play all 16 games, locked and loaded.
I was going to say, Zeke's a beast, you know, as long as he can avoid, you know, going to too many electro concerts and pushing around skinny dudes, then I think it'll be okay. But, you know, it's one of those things just to keep an eye on. All of this is is relative. Everything comes down to picking the right player every time. And that is why you use Total Foresight and fantasyforesight.com to make sure you get it right. We just want to add that cold, hard truth perspective with the analytics.
You nailed it. And there are a number of variables. It isn't always just health and injury. There are off the field issues. There are personality issues that go into it. And part of what goes into Total Foresight is how often are you on the field? Are you being suspended? Do you have these other variables going on that could affect your playing time and your ability to score me fantasy points? Listen, we may joke, and at the end of the day, we're playing fantasy football, and that's what this podcast is about. So I care whether or not you're on the field, whether or not you're behaving off the field, so you can come on and score me some fantasy points because I want to win my championship.
Well said. Well, Steve, how's it looking for the ADP RB4s?
Well, guys, I mean, so here's where you're going to start seeing a lot more of that volatility at the position kind of rear its ugly head. And what makes having, if you can secure one of those top picks in your redraft league, so valuable is the volatility we're going to start seeing here. So last season, hey, this is great. You take Ezekiel Elliott at the 4 spot, going at the 105 on average. He finishes RB5, and that's a perfect return on investment. You can't be too much happier with what he gave you where you're drafting him. Now, looking towards 2017, there you have Devonta Freeman. You're taking him at the 107 is the RB4 in your redraft league, but he's only giving you an RB15 return, which is, it's okay. Now, here's where it's going to start kind of going downhill and going downhill fast. In 2016, Lamar Miller, which he just keeps hanging around in fantasy football, I swear. Lamar Miller is actually the running back 4 in redraft that year, believe it or not, going at the 110 and finishes RB16, which that's a bust. Yep. And then in 2015, you have Jamal Charles.
Ugh.
Which, once upon a time, Jamal, you were a fantasy stud. And this is where all of that ended, actually. It was in 2015. You had Jamal Charles going at the 105, so high draft equity. Finishes as RB49, and I believe that was his final ACL tear of his career that particular season. Cool. And then in 2014, Adrian Peterson going as the RB4, drafted at the 105, finishes as RB123 because his season was shortened due to a suspension. As you recall, he played 1 week and missed the rest of the season. Destroyed fantasy dreams that year.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the volatility is really showing tonight. You're getting ripped off 80% of the time. You're getting a really nice ROI only 20% of the time. You're busting 60% of the time. And then it's just okay after that. So far when you're looking at it, aside from Le'Veon Bell as the RB1 in 2017, those top tier elite echelon ADP RB1s are returning you on average an RB4 value over the last 5 years. Again, when you take out Lev not playing in 2017. So that tells me when you're going through and snaking in your draft that you want to go after the top RB1, but then if you miss on that guy, don't just go with the perception and the chalk for RB2 and RB3. Our data says at that point, you might want to consider going wide receiver, and we'll get to more of that next week.
All right, Ben and Steve, how about this? For everybody listening at home, if you're following along and listening to these rankings closely year over year for each position, this year's RB4 is Christian McCaffrey. If you look at the data, every single year, one of the top 4 has a season-ending injury.
Never going to happen.
That is so
talk about don't put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby. Don't put that evil on my guy, CMC.
I'm not saying it's CMC, but I'm saying history shows that one of these top-end running backs will suffer a season-ending injury if you look at every season over the past 5 years. So Saquon, Alvin Kamara, Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey, one of these guys, more often than not, is going to go down with injury. It's crazy to look at now and think of one of these guys not being there.
And again, not to, I guess, jump the gun too much, but what we're going to talk about at the end of this podcast goes right along with that. It's why it's so difficult to have guys succeed multiple seasons in that high tier year after year. You get that tread on your tires, and it's just sometimes it's hard to shake that off. And running back is just a position of attrition, as they say.
Listen, man, sometimes you're at the practice facility, you're soaking up some Gatorade, you're working out, focusing on football. Other times you're out partying and getting into arguments and facing possible suspensions. But, whatever, it's fine. All right.
Listen. I hear what both of you guys are saying. All I know is when we're talking about nothing else but CMC, he's going to be that 20% in the ADP RB4 as of today. That man is going to be a beast. My bet to be RB1 this season. What?
Love it.
I would not be surprised, man. I would not be surprised. Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered the top 4, the elite of the elite. So let's move into this next group. RB5 and ADP over the last 5 years, Steve. How did they do?
A little bit of a bounce back from the RB4s, actually. So you have Alvin Kamara last season going at the 106 in drafts, finishes as RB4. So you're taking the guy at RB5, he's giving you an RB4 return on investment. You're going to be extremely happy with that. Now in 2017, you had LaShawn McCoy as your RB5 in redraft, going at the 108. Gives you an RB7 finish. And again, very nice return on investment. You're going to be happy with that pick all day long. Now, in 2016, Adrian Peterson, which is amazing that he's going into his 87th season next year, because how he bounced back from this injury that put him out in 2016 and is still playing today is beyond my knowledge. But he was going at the 111 as your RB5 in redraft, finishes as RB118.
I did not realize that many running backs played in the NFL in a season. we learn something new every episode. There you go.
Speaks to the volatility of the position, no?
No,
precisely. I could get in there for a snap or two. Literally, that's all I would last. And then in 2015, you had Marshawn Lynch going as your RB5 at the 109, finishes RB55.
Hey, that's a success compared to 118.
Yeah, true. I mean, that would make him like somewhat flexible in a pinch. Right. And then in 2014, and I hate to bring up his name again because in this time it was successful, which is why I drafted Eddie Lacy the next year. But Eddie Lacy was your RB5 going at the 106, coming off a great rookie season.
It still hurts.
I know. Finishes as RB6. Just gives you a very nice return on investment. And overall, like I said, better than the RB4s, but, certainly not like that upper tier guys.
Yeah, definitely more of a bounce back. You're getting a nice ROI 60% of the time, but 40% of the time it's an outright bust. So there is some volatility, but the odds are on your side. And with the odds on your side, and then you're using total foresight to help you out, you got a pretty good chance to make a good pick.
I love the fact that you use the phrase bounce back, because the guy currently going at RB5 at the 106 overall is David Johnson, who I think surprised a lot of people. Everybody expected him to be a top-end running back coming in next year, but he finished RB9. That's okay. I think that was the most quiet RB1 level performance I've ever seen, and everybody's dogging him. I'm glad to see him going at 106 and RB5 because he is definitely worthy of that ranking. And guys, everybody, if you're listening at home, right now we are at RB5, and he is going 106 in drafts. 5 out of the first 6 picks in drafts are running backs.
Yeah, they are. And I mean, history tells us that they're not all going to return on that investment. So it'll be really interesting to see, number one, as we get closer to the season, how those final ADP results shake out. And then number two, of those results, who is the one to be the last man standing?
We covered it again at RB5. We see more season-ending injuries in that 5-year history. Just something else to keep in mind. And like Steve has pointed out, those scars can last a lifetime. All right, Steve, let's take a look at RB6 and ADP over the last 5 years. How did they do?
Well, Jay, kind of right in line with some of the last running back positions we've looked at for the most part. You have Saquon Barkley last year, who was our running back 6, going at the 106. And of course, we know that he had an outstanding rookie season, one of the finest we've seen in fantasy football, possibly ever. Finishes as the RB3 last year in PPR.
Predicted right here on this podcast.
Oh, Jay, you called that. That was one
nailed it.
Nailed.
Lies.
My guy. All right, sorry.
And then in 2017, you have Melvin Gordon going at the 110, finishes RB5. Beautiful return on investment right there. In 2016, you got Le'Veon Bell going at the 112, finishes RB3. You would soak that up all day long in redraft if you could. And then where things kind of take a little bit of a downhill slide, you've got in 2015, CJ Anderson going at the 111. It's hard to believe he was a first-round pick in fantasy football. Finishes as running back 36. So certainly a bust on that one. And then, my gosh, I keep hating to bring my personal fantasy football woes into this, but guys, in 2014, Monty Ball. Yeah.
Oh, wait. What?
Monty Ball. He was the RB6 just because he was going to be the starter in a Peyton Manning offense, going at the 110, finishes as RB85.
Is that good?
Yeah, man. Is that good? Shut up.
So, no. Okay. All right.
So just like the RB5, you got a strong ROI rate versus bust rate of 60-40. So the numbers are on your side. We're going to be here to help you make sure you make that right pick. So let's track it real quick. Top tier guy seemed like a pretty solid investment. Then it takes a little bit of a dip from RB2 to RB4. And then so far, RB5 and RB6 look like a little bit of a bounce back. Jay, who are we talking about as RB6 this season?
You're not going to believe this. It's Le'Veon Bell at the 108, sneaking up the charts. So,
Crazy eyes Adam Gase like some Lev Bell? Is he hate some Lev Bell? Is he going to, most importantly, is he going to use Lev Bell?
You know what? That running game has been sneaky good in the past, so you never know, and I think people are buying in. Lev Bell going RB6 overall at the 108. Very interesting. And I do want to comment, Steve mentioned it, for RB5s in 2017, finishing 7th overall was Melvin Gordon. The 1 year he finished the season healthy. That's what he's capable of if he can stay healthy. That is a perfect segue to dive into our RB7 in ADP overall.
I'm sitting here looking at Melvin Gordon last season. He is your RB7 in drafts in 2018, going at the 109, and he finishes exactly where you took him, as the RB7. And as we know, he missed a good handful of games, which he's pretty much locked and loaded for doing pretty much every year except what you just spoke of. You're right. I thought he would have been a little more on the low-end RB1 part of the spectrum, but here he is. He finishes RB7. Now, in 2017, we had Jay Ajayi going as your RB7 at the 202, finished running back 31, and certainly he was a bust that people felt in 2017. Now, in 2016, we had Devonta Freeman going at the 207 as your RB7 in drafts, finishes as the RB6. So you're perfectly happy with the return on investment that you got from Freeman that season. Now, in 2015, going at the 202, your RB7 in redrafts is Matt Forte, and he gives you an RB10 finish. Perfectly acceptable return on investment right there. And then in 2014, DeMarco Murray was your RB7 going at the 202 and put up RB3 numbers in redraft that year.
My man. Yeah. Looking at the 5-year history for the ADP RB7s, man, it's pretty strong. 80% of the time you're getting a strong ROI, 20% of the time you're busting. And over the 5-year history, the average finish is RB11. That is a strong ROI over a long history, a very nice sample size. So pay attention to that ADP RB7 this year. I know who you're about to tell us it is today, Jay, but remember, it's May, so we'll see what it is when we're actually all redrafting in a few months here.
I was going to say, we're finding a nice little trend here with the RB5, 6, and 7 in ADPs, and RB7 is the most consistent almost overall so far, and I got to tell you, the current RB7 going in drafts at the 109, the 9th overall pick in drafts right now is none other than Melvin Gordon. What are we? No, what?
Well, remember, Jay, in some of our review pods just a couple of months ago, we started to come around to the concept as we were reviewing the running backs that you just got to come to terms that there is a tier of running backs who are going to miss a couple of games, but they can still give you over the course of a season RB1 numbers. So you got to stay flexible, stay adaptable, take what the draft gives you, but there is a certain point where it starts to behoove you to take a guy like Melvin Gordo.
As long as you have the correct expectation, then you can plan and deal accordingly. All right, so we just reeled off the best RB position in ADP so far. So, Steve, are we going to keep it going at RB8 in ADP? Were they rock solid for the last 5 years?
No, for whatever reason, the RB8 spot just hasn't looked that great.
Come on, man.
Last season, the guy you took at the RB8 finished RB39, bust. In 2017, RB17, okay. 2016, RB111. Again, Jamal Charles. 2015, Jeremy Hill, RB24, bust. And then in 2014, you did have my man, Marshawn Beast Mode Lynch, going at the RB8, finishes RB4. Beautiful return on investment with that draft pick.
Yeah, the one and only at the ADP RB8 position over the last 5 years. Talk about going back to ripoffsville. 80% of the time, you are not getting a strong ROI. So it's really looking like RBs 5 to 7 is kind of the sweet spot if you miss out on the RB1 overall.
Completely agree. And we saw this in the quarterback ADP and return on investment, where you had one position with extremely consistent value, and then the very next spot extremely inconsistent value, and we're seeing it again here with the RB8. And this season, going RB8 with the 10th overall selection is none other than maybe the hottest topic so far in this offseason, Todd Gurley, and that knee, my friends.
You know what? Again, it's only May, but it is pretty ironic that we're having all these conversations mainstream about TG3, and then he happens to be at this super volatile point right after we got past a super consistent tier, and we're about to get to this bonus content where he has been an elite running back each of the last 2 seasons. It's going to be, numbers are not on his side to repeat. The knee seems determined to help derail that. Oh man, that is a scary proposition. I totally get if you are, shooting for the stars, rolling the dice, thinking, hey, if I can get an RB2 return at RB8, I'm going to be a league winning pick right here. But man, you can definitely lose your whole season.
Well, see, and I'm glad you said that, because a big reason is the draft capital you are investing in all of these players so far. It is drastically different for the quarterbacks. At this point in drafts, we were talking about 7th round selections or 5th round selections. We are still talking about 1st round picks. Your rock, your cornerstone of your fantasy team or franchise. So you cannot miss these picks. It's do or die. So let's move on to the back end of the running back positions. And next up, we have the RB9 in ADP, Steve. Were they as bad as the RB8s?
Actually, you know what? The RB9s, for whatever reason, coincidence, whatever you want to call it, not a single bust amongst them in the past half decade.
Wow.
What?
Yeah, I know. It's pretty insane, right? It's kind of like just a beautiful sweet spot. So in 2018, your RB9 finishes RB11. Great return on investment. 2017 finishes as RB11. Again, nice return on investment there. In 2016, you get an RB4 finish out of the RB9. Beautiful. That'll help you win your league making that pick. Then in 2015, you got an RB17 finish, which it's still a nice return on investment overall. It's not a home run hit, but you're okay with that. And then in 2014, you've got an RB18 finish out of the position. And again, not bad at all.
Man, talk about a rebound from what we saw out of the RB8s. You're looking at the RB9 over the last 5 years, averaging an RB12 return. That is a rock solid safety. 60% of the time, strong ROI. 40% of the time, okay ROI. What I love is the no bust city. So it will be interesting to look at these last RBs, but man, you see a pretty defined pattern here as far as the 5-year numbers go. So Jay, who are we talking about as this rock solid stud this year at RB9?
I love how you guys paint this picture for me, and then I get to announce who this guy is. Going 12th overall in drafts, the last pick of most of your first rounds at RB9 overall is James Conner. Wow.
I like it, man. A lot of people are harping on him for how he fell off towards the end of the season. People need to remember, man was recovering from cancer. So yeah, maybe he lost a little bit of his wind as the season went on. Let's see how he does year 2 after beating cancer.
I am not going to argue with that whatsoever, my friend. Let's move on to RB10s and round out this group. So Steve, in ADP RB10s, how did that group fare?
You know, it is pretty polarizing actually when you look at it. So last season, you had Christian McCaffrey slot slotted in that RB10 spot at the 201 in drafts, went RB1. And then, yeah, exactly. Outstanding.
Diamond.
And then in 2017, Kareem Hunt's rookie season, he's there at the 207, finishes RB4. You remember that incredible rookie season.
Yeah.
But then I'm not even going to say the names because it'll just gross everybody out. But in 2016, I will say it actually. Eddie Lacy finishes. We're just picking on Eddie Lacy here. He's sitting with his millions of dollars eating cheeseburgers right now, laughing
That
at
wound is still fresh, Steve. I can tell.
Sorry.
Nobody's bitter. Foresight Encyclopedia is not bitter about Eddie Lacy at all.
No, not at all. So he finishes as RB72. And then in 2015, you had your RB10 finish as a running back 38. And then in 2014, you had your RB10 finish as RB57.
Yeah, that's not good. So, we're back to the same old volatility at the RB position, back to going 60-40 in the favor of the bust odds. And you do not like seeing that. But, 40% of the time is still a pretty significant chunk of the pie.
But guys, I'm noticing an interesting trend. We talked about a sweet spot with that RB 5, 6, 7 spot, and now all we're seeing is boom and bust every other pick now. It's like, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad, right next to one another in drafts. It's just the roller coaster these last few picks has been extreme, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. I was just smiling and laughing because you made me think of Michael Scott, like snip, snap, back and forth, back and forth. You're right, man. At 1 year, it's an amazing return on the investment. The next year, it could be season-losing bust disaster in your first round of your draft.
And it's just these guys are going in such succession, which is why it's so pivotal. You hit on these picks. You don't want to be one of these bust picks.
So who are you talking about at ADP RB10 this year, man?
We're hitting the down cycle here. So on the down pick, the RB10 this season right now, going early in the second round at the 203 is Joe Mixon.
Man, that's pretty interesting. I mean, a lot of people are pretty high on Joe Mixon. Got a little bit of ouchiness. He still ended up being an RB1 last season. But that offense is a question mark. It's in a transitional year. It's kind of So it'll be interesting to see how he ends up. And I know it's May, but again, the narrative of these players that you're talking about, Jay, lines up with the nameless numbers that you're talking about, Steve. And it's really interesting how even at this point in the offseason, there's so much correlation between the two.
Well, this podcast was a roller coaster with Joe Mixon last season, so let's continue this ride in our preparation for the 2019 season. Steve, in RB11 and ADP, tell us about this group. I'm guessing a bounce back.
A little bit of a mixed bag here. So last year, Dalvin Cook finishes as RB31. Definite bust. Dalvin Cook owners can attest. The previous season, I do have to say Todd Gurley bounced back huge once he got out from under Jeff Fisher's offense and Todd McShay joined the crew there in LA. And he finished as the RB1 in all of fantasy football coming out of that 11 spot in 2017. And then prior to that, you have an RB9 finish out of Mark Ingram, which is a great return on investment. You get, believe it or not, Lamar Miller out of that RB11 spot, finishes RB5, beautiful. And then in 2014, you had Andre Ellington finish as the RB17, which was, solid.
And hilarious that you just referenced Andre Ellington in a relevant fantasy spot. But back to Jay's point of the boom, bust, we're back to a boom. Right after the RB10s averaged RB34 over the last 5 years, the RB11s averaged RB13 over the last 5 years, which is a rock solid 80% of the time you're getting a no bust rate, 60% strong ROI, 20% okay ROI, only 20% of the time are you busting. So Jay, I need you to tell me, who are we talking about as RB11 this year, man?
So our rock solid, not gonna bust candidate is at RB11 at the 206 mark in drafts, none other than Dalvin Cook, captain bust material.
I call foul, my friend. You know what? This is one of the ones, the hype train's going to be real. He's going to get into that RB6, that RB8, that RB10 spot before all the ADPs all said and done. You just watch.
Let's just talk about the RB12 and ADPs and who's going in that spot. And these two positions are going to switch, and those players are going to go in the appropriate appropriate position. So, Steve, take us away.
Last year, Devontae Freeman finishes RB 99. 2017, Christian McCaffrey's breakout rookie season finishes RB 8. Beautiful. Prior to that, out of the 12 spot, you get an RB 47 finish. In 2015, you get an RB 14 finish. And then in 2014, you get an RB 5 finish out of one Arian Foster.
Oh, what's up, Arian? He showed out 5 years ago, but overall, the ADP RB12 is not looking too good with a 35 positional average. 60% of the time, you are getting a strong ROI over the last 5 years, but 40% of the time, you are busting. So it is pretty boom or bust. You know, it's similar to what we've seen at earlier points in this draft. And you are starting to talk about just a little bit more reasonable draft equity when you get to this RB12 point. So, Jay, this year, who are we talking about as ADP RB12?
Okay, now see, and this is why I'm going to tell you these two players should switch positions before we get to the actual draft point. Because right now going as RB12 at the 208 point in drafts is Nick Chubb. Now, if I got to look at Dalvin Cook and Nick Chubb, I'm going to assume that Nick Chubb is going to be Mr. Consistent and give me a better chance of having a positive return on investment rather than boom bust Dalvin Cook, who seems much more appropriately valued at that RB12 spot, which we have shown over the last 5 years has been very boom bust.
Yeah, Chubb is a beast. Chubb has lasted longer in a season at a higher productive level in limited work his first year than Dalvin Cook has in his first two. So I have all the confidence in the world beyond the homerism of being a diehard Browns fan in Nick Chubb. And, you know, Dalvin Cook in his range of outcomes is a solid RB1 within that range. Absolutely. Is him busting out and missing some time and finishing his RB39, something like that again within that range? Absolutely.
Hey, real quick, looking at this list, a lot of interesting players before we get into some of this extra data. If you'll take a look at the last 5 years, the best season in the last 5 years had two players go down with significant injuries. So at best, two of these players will be lost due to significant injury this season, and you are drafting them in the first 18 picks in drafts. Yeah. That is a lot of draft capital. You got to get it right. That's why we're here.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're talking about over the last 5 years, from the ADP RB1 to the ADP RB12, you were talking about premium draft equity everywhere from the 101 spot as late as the 307 spot. So the latest, the ADP RB12 has been taken over the last 5 years is 307. That is still high quality draft equity, and you cannot afford to miss in the top 3 rounds. So the overarching takeaways from this running back study is RB1 is surprisingly accurate. RB2 to RB4 is extremely volatile. RB5 to RB7 seems like a sweet spot for strong ROI odds. RB9 is the unicorn, and RB11 and 12 hit more often than not at a 60-40 boom bust rate. And, you know, you might want to consider wide receivers or Kelsey at highly volatile early points of your draft.
All right, guys, let's get into some of this bonus coverage. What do you have cooking for me?
Steve's got all of this research he does for his blog work before he teamed up with Fantasy Foresight. And this is just another one of his great deep dive analytical studies that really sheds light on the volatility as far as the top 12 and the top 5 performers at the running back position. How consistent can they be? How likely is it that a top 12 running back is going to be a top 12 running back the next season? How likely is it that a top 5 running back is going to be a top 5 running back next season? And then he takes it a step further and sees in each of those categories how likely it is for them to three-peat. So looking back over the last 5 years, when you talk about the percentage rate of the top 12 running backs being a top 12 running back for back-to-back seasons, it's only 38.3% of the time on average over the last 5 seasons. So there is a handful of guys every season, 2 out of 5, that are going to be, so really in 12 guys, more like 4 and change out of 12, that are going to return on your investment every season. So that's pretty encouraging, right?
Well, yeah, until you think of the fact that 8 of them are not possibly going to.
That's what you need. That's what we're here for, man. FantasyForesight.com. Total Foresight's going to help you pick the right one.
Okay, now we've got some guys on this list who have been consistent performers for 2 years. So what is their chance of achieving that for a third consecutive season?
Drops down in half to 19.9%.
Wow.
And so, Steve, who do we have this year that is in that category that has the opportunity at a top 12 three-peat?
Well, at least the guys we want to be concerned about, right? I think that we can probably go ahead and just exclude Kareem Hunt from being somebody who's going to three-peat a top 12 performance.
Yeah, he's one of those 80% that's not going to do it.
And that stuff happens each and every season. So we're going to focus on looking at Christian McCaffrey. He's going for that ever-elusive three-peat. Ezekiel Elliott. We got Todd Gurley and Alvin Kamara. Very interesting group of backs, guys.
Yeah, and if you look at the percentage, you're telling me one of those guys is actually going to finish as a top 12 RB this season based on the fact that only 20% accomplished that feat. Very interesting stuff when you take a look at the injury risk we've discussed, the probability of repeat performances, and now we're talking about a very few going after something that is not done very often.
Yeah, I mean, back in 2014, it was as high as 40%. And with the amazing talent that you just named at running back, hopefully they all stay healthy. And this is one of those up years for this average. But yeah, over the last 5 years, 20%. It's something you got to take into consideration when you're trying to make a decision between this or that guy in your draft. Now, when you look at the top five, the elite over the last 5 years, only 20% of the time do they repeat. And the exact same is true for the three-peat. 20% of the time, the top five is going to repeat. 20% of the top five is able to three-peat on average over the last 5 years.
Okay, so one of these guys in the top five is going to finish there once again.
Who are we talking about this year, Steve, as far as the opportunity to do that?
So we're looking at Todd Gurley and Alvin Kamara. And of course, I think I probably speak for a lot of people where yeah, exactly. We're all very, I mean, there's a lot of red flags. And that's what I mean. During the course of this entire study, there has only been one running back who has put together 3 consecutive top 5 fantasy finishes. And that's Marshawn Lynch. And that's on the very back end of this study. He did it from actually 2011 through 2014. We haven't seen it since. It is just such a rarefied air to be in to be able to accomplish this. So if it means making a decision between taking, say, Ezekiel Elliott versus Alvin Kamara, just statistically, it's just kind of like, well, what's harder to do? 3 straight top 5s or 3 straight top 12s? And I know we're splitting hairs a little bit trying to make that kind of a decision based on that, but I mean, you kind of get down to at some point in time just kind of having to make a decision, and what are you going to do that based on?
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to get into the wide receivers next week, but I'm really looking forward to, at the end of this 4-part series, to take all of the complementary data where it says it looks safest to go running back at this point versus it looks safest to go wide receiver at that point, and hopefully with all of it combined, we can formulate a really high quality draft strategy for everyone to help craft a championship winning roster.
Absolutely, Ben.
Thank you. Like usual, we have run over longer than we anticipated. So I'm going to just breeze through one more bonus angle that Steve had provided to us on the 5-year history of the running back by round. In summary, pretty much only 9% of all the running backs drafted in the top 4 rounds over the last 5 years have returned an okay ROI. It's very equivalent on the boom or bust side from there. So it's pretty much a 50-50 crapshoot in rounds 1 through 4 that you are going to boom or bust. So choose wisely.
Wow. So it doesn't even matter if I'm investing top-end draft capital or I'm waiting till round 4. The likelihood of getting value for my investment stays the same. 50-50, like you said, boom or bust. And I'll be honest, guys, this is the second position group we've covered. And the glaring thing that is jumping off the page at me, once again, is exactly that following ADPs, following the masses, following all the noise out there who is telling you who to pick, who to draft, who to value, has a 50-50 shot of being right. And we on this podcast are here to tell you, trust Total Foresight, trust the numbers. We've shown that we can be better than 50%.
Yes, we have. We've got a nice history of our accuracy. And you know what? I love these studies. I love the angles that Steve's bringing us. I love the fact that that your top and elite running backs are really validated as safe, consistent investments. And then I cannot wait to get into the complimentary wide receiver information next week. Anybody got anything else before we wrap it up tonight?
No, once again, learned a lot, guys. I look at these big names going all at the top of drafts. You see some of the volatility. You see some of the expectation that some of them are not going to be there come at the end of the season, and trying to figure out that puzzle of who's going to be the true value this season is why we're here and why we're doing this. And it gets me excited to keep going and continue our preparation.
Yeah, man, we're just a few days away from June and just a few short episodes away from our preview podcast episodes, man. Everything that goes into preparing you for your fantasy redraft season.
Hey, and I'm glad you brought up something that we're all...
Yeah, I know what you're getting into.
We always talk about how we're always working, always looking to bring you more of a value, and we are proud to announce, along with this episode of this podcast, the new Fantasy Foresight Podcast Player, a dedicated app available in the iOS store with your Apple phone. So go out, download it. It's a great way to find all of our archived episodes, a great player for this episode. Go out, check it out. We're always looking to bring you more and more and more.
We always say you got to adapt in your draft. You got to adapt at fantasyforesight.com. We're here to continue to bring you nothing but the best and continue to get better and better to help you bring home a fantasy championship.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you pod. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.